Muito bem, retomando aqui o 21º Seminário de Comércio Internacional do IBRAC, nós estamos na nossa segunda manhã de painéis, indo para o segundo painel. A moderação do painel dessa manhã, que é sobre medidas de comércio relativas às questões de carbono, é do embaixador Rubens Barbosa. E não poderíamos estar em melhores mãos. O embaixador tem, por meio do IRICE, sido uma voz muito ativa e tem trazido as questões de meio ambiente e comércio para o centro do debate. E é um assunto inescapável no comércio internacional do Brasil hoje, e por isso passo a palavra a ele para as devidas apresentações dos nossos palestrantes nesse tema hoje tão caro. Embaixador, o senhor tem a palavra, condução aqui dos trabalhos.
Bom dia a todos, bom dia, obrigado René pelo convite, então muito prazer em estar aqui na companhia da Vera Tosten, uma grande amiga e colaboradora de muitos anos, e também dos nossos palestrantes. Esse tema do mercado de carbono é muito importante, vai estar no centro das discussões agora do Acordo de Paris, em Glasgow. Esse mercado já existe na Europa, há um projeto de lei agora nos Estados Unidos também para regular o mercado, e nós aqui no Brasil estamos, como em quase tudo, atrasados, né? O assunto está para ser regulamentado, o Banco Central, junto com o Ministério da Economia, mas aí há muito pouco debate também sobre isso, não se sabe direito qual é a regulamentação que está sendo feita, e com isso o Brasil está perdendo mais uma oportunidade. Não é? Pela existência de uma vasta área do território nacional, né, na Amazônia, com possibilidades de ser incluída nesse mercado, nós estamos atrasados, estamos perdendo tempo para nos juntarmos a esse processo de negociação. O segundo, enfim, me foi informado, e nós temos aqui a presença, nós temos como speakers a Tetyana Payosova e o Warren Maruyama, que deverão fazer a apresentação. A Tetyana sobre a Europa e o Warren sobre o projeto de lei no mercado americano. Então, sem mais delongas, eu passo, e depois vamos ter como debatedora a Vera, né, que vai comentar, aí nós vamos ter, se tivermos tempo, perguntas aí da assistência. Então, sem mais delongas, eu passo a palavra pela ordem aqui para a Tetyana iniciar a sua apresentação. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada, embaixador Barbosa. Bom dia a todos desde Genebra. Para começar, eu gostaria de agradecer ao embaixador Barbosa por essa introdução e aos organizadores pelo convite. É um grande prazer ter essa oportunidade para conversar com vocês sobre um tema tão importante no discurso de comércio internacional e as mudanças climáticas. A proposta da Comissão Europeia para um novo mecanismo de ajustamento das emissões de carbono nas fronteiras foi publicada em 14 de julho nesse ano. Essa proposta faz uma parte do Pacto Ecológico Europeu e da estratégia para alcançar um impacto neutro no clima até 2050. Ao mesmo tempo, o mecanismo proposto, sem dúvidas, afetará o comércio internacional. Hoje vou falar sobre 5 pontos: justificativa e âmbito de aplicação do CBAM, características principais do CBAM, o que CBAM significa para as empresas, o que CBAM significa para os outros países e, finalmente, a significância da proposta para o Brasil. Se vocês permitirem, agora vou mudar para o inglês no restante da minha apresentação. With respect to the rationale of the CBAM, the European Commission makes clear that the CBAM, so the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is to address carbon leakage. That is the situation where the European producers need to pay a price for the carbon that is emitted in the process of production of certain goods, whereas the same imported goods do not bear a price for carbon that is emitted when these goods are produced in other third countries. So the idea of the CBAM, or behind the CBAM, is to apply carbon pricing both to domestic products and to imported products. As we know, in the EU, there is a European system for carbon pricing, that is the emission trading scheme, whereas imported products to date have not been subject to any similar measures. As for the scope of the CBAM, it covers specific products. There are 5 categories of products listed in Annex 1 of the proposal. These are cement, electricity, fertilizers, iron and steel, and aluminum. The proposal covers, or this annex covers, both simple and complex goods. To give an example, the simple goods are steel or iron, and the complex goods are those goods that are produced from steel and iron, for instance, doors and frames that are made of steel and iron, and that are listed in the same annex. So goods that are not listed in the annex are not covered currently by the proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism. The proposal covers greenhouse gas emissions that are listed also in Annex 1. These emissions are primarily the CO2 emissions, and for some goods, the proposal also addresses the nitrous oxide emissions. It is important to note that currently the CBAM proposal addresses only direct emissions, that are those emissions that result from the production process of the goods. And it does not cover indirect emissions, that are the emissions from the production of electricity, heating, and cooling that were then used in the production process. In terms of the geographical scope, the CBAM proposal essentially applies to all countries, with the exception of those that are listed in Annex 2. And these countries are Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland. The rationale for excluding those countries, as the proposal makes clear, is that either they apply the EU ETS system, which is the case for Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, or they have a domestic emission trading scheme that is linked to the EU emission trading scheme. And this is the case for Switzerland. The proposal also makes clear that it is possible for other countries to be included in Annex 1, in Annex 2, if they meet the same requirements. So if they have an ETS, and if that ETS is linked to the EU ETS. And it is also important that the price for the ETS certificates, that is to say the carbon price, is effectively paid in the country of origin. It is interesting that the proposal makes clear that countries that have a carbon pricing mechanism that is different from the ETS scheme may negotiate an agreement with the European Union. However, as a result of that agreement, these countries will not be excluded from the scope of the carbon border adjusted mechanism. The only result will be that importers will be able to reduce the number of CBAM certificates, about which I'm going to speak in a minute, which they need to buy to cover their emissions. Now moving on to the key features of the CBAM proposal. First of all, CBAM is not strictly speaking a tax, and it is not levied on the border. So it is an internal measure. The CBAM proposal, or the CBAM mechanism, is operationalized through the so-called CBAM certificates So these are electronic certificates that are issued by national CBAM authorities of EU member states. And one certificate corresponds to 1 ton of embedded emissions. These certificates will be valid for 2 years. And during these 2 years, they can be used to essentially pay with them for the embedded emissions of the imported products. They can be also sold back to the authority, but only within the first year of validity. It is also interesting to note that the price of the CBAM certificates is directly linked to the EU ETS system. Namely, the proposal makes clear that the price of the CBAM certificates will be determined based on the average weekly price of the EU ETS certificates. And this price then will be published by the European Commission. So how the embedded emissions will be calculated? The annex to the proposal clarifies that the main method to calculate the embedded emissions is essentially to calculate the actual emissions during the production process. This, of course, means quite a high administrative burden as well for the producers in third countries, especially in those third countries where to date the producers did not have to calculate emissions. In case where actual emissions cannot be calculated, the Commission will then request importers to rely on the default values. And there are 2 options for how the default values can be determined. The first option is that the European Commission will essentially determine the default values for each specific third country, for each product category. And those emissions, those default values will be based on average emissions for that particular product in that particular country. Now, this presupposes that there should be some information, so some reports, maybe governmental reports, maybe some scientific reports, articles that would clarify what are the average or the common emissions for a particular product in a particular sector that is covered by the CBAM. Now, if that is not available, if that information is not available, then what the Commission will do, it will essentially rely on the average emissions of the 10% worst performing EU installations for that particular good. So essentially, it will apply the worst data that is available for the EU producers to calculate embedded emissions of imported products. It is important to note also that the importers will be able to request adjustment of default values based on the regional characteristics or specificities, and then they will need to provide also evidence why, for instance, the default emissions should be lower in a particular case. Now, what does CBAM mean for business? The main burden of the CBAM is, of course, on the importers, which are the main responsible actors according to the CBAM. They will need to report the emissions to the national authorities, embedded emissions. However, to be able to report those embedded emissions, the importers, of course, will demand this information from producers in third countries, which effectively means that the homework will need to be done by producers in third countries. In terms of obligations for business, there are essentially 2 phases. So there first will be a transitional phase during the period of 2023 to 2025. And during that period, the importers will need to submit the so-called CBAM report on quarterly basis. And in that report, they will need to indicate embedded emissions both for indirect and direct emissions for imported goods. and also any information on the carbon price that was already paid abroad. And the main idea behind this requirement is that, first of all, it gives the business some periods of time to adjust to the new requirements, and for the Commission also to receive some information on whether essentially the system is working well, and also to collect information about the indirect emissions. Because as I have mentioned, currently the CBAM proposal does not cover the indirect emissions, but it is possible that by the end of this transitional period, so by the end of 2025, the Commission may decide also to include indirect emissions in the calculation of the emissions for which the CBAM certificates will need to be purchased. And an interesting point is also that even during this transitional period, the national authorities will be able to impose penalties if importers do not comply with their obligations. Now, the actual implementation of the CBAM starts in 2026. And starting from 2026, importers will need to register as the so-called authorized declarants with the national authorities. And it is very important that they are registered as authorized declarants, because otherwise they won't be able to import goods that fall within the scope of CBAM. And those authorized declarants, so importers, will need to submit annually a CBAM declaration. And according to that declaration, they will indicate the total quantity of the goods that are covered by CBAM that were imported during the previous calendar year, the total amount of embedded emissions, and also the amount of CBAM certificates that will be surrendered then to cover for or to compensate for those embedded emissions. So every authorized declarant will have an electronic account where the CBAM certificates will be essentially stored, and then at the end of the period, of the reporting period, they will have to surrender those certificates to the national authorities to compensate for the emissions. It is also important to note that the embedded emissions starting from 2026 will need to be verified. So there will be a verification, official verification process. And who will be authorized to verify is not currently clear. So it's not clear, according to the current proposal, if it's going to be only the EU verifiers or whether it could be also a foreign authorized verifier that will be able to conduct that verification. As you can imagine, this will, again, it might entail quite significant administrative burden if EU verifiers would have to travel all over the world to provide that verification. Finally, the importers will also need to keep the records of all the reports, so embedded emissions, imports for the products for several years. The producers in third countries can register with the national EU CBAM authorities and submit their embedded emissions for verification. And as a result of that verification, they can be registered in a special EU register for 5 years. And this will allow EU importers to rely on the data that has been submitted already in the register. So it makes for importers a little bit easier to deal with this requirement. Now, what are the implications of CBAM for other countries? First of all, as I have mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, essentially there are 3 categories of countries. The first category of countries are the ones that are excluded from the scope of CBAM. So essentially they don't need to adjust to the CBAM requirements. The second category of countries are those countries that may potentially already have the ETS in place, but this ETS is not yet linked to the EU ETS, so they will probably try to negotiate with the European Union the linking of their ETS system. And then the third category of countries are all the other countries that may even have a carbon pricing mechanism at home, but as we know, it is not sufficient to be exempted from the CBAM requirements. Now, currently, the EU is conducting public consultations until October this year. And as far as we know, there are currently bilateral consultations ongoing between EU and other countries that are affected by this CBAM proposal, both within the framework of the WTO and also in other fora. And it is very much important, of course, for the countries to express their concerns, specific concerns, and try to still maybe suggest some changes that could be implemented by the European Commission in the final CBAM mechanism that will be adopted. In terms of implications for Brazil, Brazil is not among the main exporters of the products that are included within the scope of the CBAM. However, I have checked some statistics, and it seems that Brazil does export certain products, certain categories of products that are covered by CBAM, and this includes, for instance, some categories of fertilizers, and also some products, aluminum products and steel, iron and steel products as well. So in terms of what Brazil would need to expect and what Brazil would need to do is, first of all, as far as I understand, currently in Brazil, there is no carbon pricing mechanism and no emission trading scheme similar to that of the EU. That means that Brazil falls within the third category of countries and is not exempted from the CBAM. That means that Brazilian producers that export the covered products would need to fully comply with the CBAM legislation when it enters into force. And this will start already in 2023. Very likely, if the Commission will adopt the CBAM on time. And as I have mentioned, this will start essentially with reporting requirements. But this also means that the producers will need to have the relevant systems, operational systems to account for those emissions. And the important point here is that the proposal still specifies that a lot of details, for instance, on the methodology to calculate indirect emissions, the Commission will adopt further implementing acts that are not yet there. So it's not even clear what the producer or how the producers will need to calculate those indirect emissions. The same goes for direct emissions. So the annex to the proposal explains some general methodology, but the specificities will need to be further detailed in an implementing act, and that is still to be adopted. So these are the points that, of course, it would be important for the producers, for the affected producers, to raise with the governments, and also for the government then to raise these issues with the European Commission. At this point, I think I would conclude and then pass the floor to the next speaker. Thank you.
Well, obrigado pela explicação, e muito completa, e mostra quão burocrático, né, vai ser esse sistema e as dificuldades que vão se colocar para todos os países. Agora, há um aspecto que eu li, não sei se vocês podem confirmar, e isso fica para depois, não vamos passar em seguida para o outro expositor, mas eu gostaria também de ouvi-las, porque, segundo eu entendo, essa questão da carbon tax poderá também se aplicar a florestas. Teria havido uma sugestão de emenda esse projeto, que diz que produtos oriundos de florestas que não estão protegidas também poderão, os países, né, também poderão ser penalizados. Seria importante, porque, como eu me referi no começo, o Brasil está atrasado não só na regulamentação, né, dessa questão da precificação por causa do mercado, que não existe aqui, como também poderá ser pouco afetado nos produtos, porque realmente as exportações nossas não são muito grandes desses produtos, mas poderá ser muito afetado na interpretação europeia dos produtos que seriam oriundos dessas florestas. Mas, de qualquer maneira, esse é um ponto para nós discutirmos depois. Eu passo a palavra agora ao senhor Warren Maruyama para fazer uma apresentação sobre o projeto de lei existente em discussão nos Estados Unidos. Muito obrigado.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Renee, for organizing this important conference, and it's an honor to be here with you, with Tetyana, Vera, and Lauro to talk about this important topic. I only wish we could do it live. I have very fond memories of going to Brazil for USTR and enjoying the caipirinhas, the barbecue, the beautiful scenery, the Christ statue, and the beaches in Rio. But it was many years, and I would love to do it again. I have less fond memories of my interactions with Brazilian negotiators because Brazil has some of the best trade negotiators in the world, both a formidable adversary, but also an important ally on important issues like bringing agriculture under binding global trade rules in the Uruguay round. I'm going to start out with some good news, which is there is no inherent clash between climate change and trade. There's nothing in the WTO rules that prevents a government that wants to do it from taking steps to control its own carbon emissions through regulation, through a cap and trade system like the EU's, or a carbon tax. The trade problem comes with border measures, where some types of carbon control regimes are much easier to square with WTO rules and therefore much less likely to lead to trade conflicts than other types of systems. The problem is that if a government regulates, taxes, or otherwise restricts carbon emissions, it's going to drive up the cost of energy and disadvantage its energy-intensive industries. Some of these industries are also going to be trade-intensive in that they either face stiff import competition or are big exporters, and in many cases, they are both. So any carbon regime that drives up the cost of energy and discourages carbon emissions is going to put these industries at a competitive advantages. And these are ones like steel, aluminum, chemicals, paper, cement, fertilizers, and the list is going to keep going on and on. These also, in most countries, tend to be big, politically potent industries that typically support large numbers of manufacturing jobs. So inevitably, there's going to be intense political pressure to do something to level the playing field. So just about every carbon regime is going to involve some form of border measure to make sure that imports from other countries that don't have an equivalent carbon regime can't get an unfair advantage, and to ensure that a country's exporters don't get priced out of overseas markets. It's also important from a climate standpoint for any carbon regime to prevent what's called carbon leakage by inadvertently creating incentives for its companies to move their manufacturing of energy-intensive products overseas, or encouraging global production to shift to countries that are laggards in adopting measures to reduce carbon. And that's where the trade problem comes in because it means doing something to ensure a level playing field with imports, keeping your exports competitive so they don't get killed and crowded out of key markets. And there are various ways of doing this. With a carbon tax, a domestic carbon tax, it's pretty straightforward since border tax adjustments can be implemented under the existing WTO rules. GATT Article 2, Paragraph 2A allows a WTO member to impose a tax on imports that's equivalent to a domestic indirect tax. And Article 3 and the notes to Article 3 provide that it's not a subsidy if an indirect tax on domestic products is rebated on exportation. So a carbon tax in trade terms would be a far better interim approach pending an international climate change agreement. Since unlike cap and trade based import restrictions, it can be implemented under the existing GATT WTO consensus in the Paris UNFCCC process or in the WTO. Well, there's been a proposal for a carbon fee in the US Senate's budget reconciliation bill. It's clearly WTO illegal because it only applies to imports. For a carbon border measure to fit within WTO rules, the import tax must parallel a domestic carbon tax so that the burden falls equally on imports and domestic production. Absent that, it raises serious questions under the WTO rules and almost inevitably is going to trigger trade conflict, most likely in the form of retaliation from US trading partners. And while the United States could make the proposal legal by enacting a domestic carbon tax, our Congress is still a long, long way from passing one or any other meaningful form of carbon reduction. President Biden and the Biden administration have put a heavy emphasis on dealing with global climate change, but to get a domestic carbon tax or another major carbon climate change measure through our Congress, they need votes. And right now, even the most fervent climate advocates will tell you that they don't have them. The challenge for the European Union is somewhat different since it's trying to fit carbon border adjustment measure, or CBAM, as Tetyana described, into a regulatory or cap and trade type system. But exactly how it's going to do this is unclear, and it's going to be very complicated. The CBAM would not qualify as a border tax adjustment under existing GATT rules because cap and trade is a regulatory scheme that essentially involves permitting requirements for industries that emit large amounts of carbon. And the WTO rules only allow members to offset an indirect tax, something that would be analogous to a VAT or a sales tax. Accordingly, absent a fundamental, and at this point completely unrealistic change in the current WTO GATT border tax adjustment rules, cap and trade would not qualify for a border adjustment and would likely represent a prima facie violation of GATT Articles 2, 3, 11, and 13. As a result, the EU is probably going to try to fit CBAM into the GATT Article 20G exception for measures to conserve exhaustible natural resources. Since the global atmosphere clearly crosses borders, it almost certainly qualifies as a natural resource. And while the appellate body and GATT panels initially took a pretty rigid view about 20G border measures that were designed to address production and processing methods, or PPMs, they started loosening the rules somewhat in the WTO appellate body's shrimp turtle decision. But fitting the EU's CBAM into Article 20G still involves serious legal challenges and is going to stretch the limits of the WTO's environmental jurisprudence possibly beyond the breaking point. In effect, under CBAM, the EU is going to be forcing goods from countries that don't have an equivalent carbon regime to acquire an EU carbon import certificate. And that's going to pit the EU against every WTO member that doesn't have a similar carbon regime. And that includes the US, China, Brazil, India, Japan, and just about every developing country. And their exporters would have to pay stiff fees and go through a nightmarish bureaucratic process in order to meet the EU's new regulatory reporting and import certificate requirements. So CBAM is going to lead to trade conflict, and it's going to split a WTO that has been struggling for a decade to show that it's still functional and relevant. More narrowly, there are going to be a host of technical issues. The EU is planning to continue handing out free emissions allowances to its domestic industries. These allowances are very, very popular since they essentially exempt energy-intensive industries from cap and trade liabilities under the EU's ETS. But it's not clear how this would square with the WTO rules if the EU plans to put a tax on imports, but essentially exempt its like domestic products from cap and trade. And if the free allowances are going to EU exporters so they can remain competitive in overseas markets, it arguably would represent a WTO illegal export subsidy. And this was, I think, one of the problems with the US cap and trade in the Waxman-Markey bill, which passed the House early in our Obama administration, but then died in the Senate. So cap and trade is probably unworkable for highly export-oriented economies like Japan, Germany, and China, absent free allowances or some other WTO illegal export subsidy. Finally, the EU system would be discriminatory since it's planning to exempt countries with similar carbon regimes, but impose it on everything else. That's going to raise issues under the chapeau to Article 20, particularly since it ignores the fact that international negotiations are still underway in the UNFCCC Paris Accord process. Legal niceties aside, CBAM is going to lead to trade conflict since many of the EU's trading partners are going to be very unhappy about these new reporting requirements, which are not going to be easy to comply with, the new tax, and the investigations of their carbon emissions. And given the breakdown of the WTO's dispute settlement system, well, whereas in the past, the recourse would be to file a dispute, now they could move more quickly to slapping a retaliatory tax on EU exports. So this thing is likely to get ugly. The ideal solution to climate change would be a fair and effective legal framework that binds all major emitters to ambitious targets for greenhouse gas emissions and defines the permissible scope of border carbon measures as part of the UN's Paris Accord UNFCCC process. But such an agreement is a long way off and the prospects are unclear at best. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Warren, pela sua apresentação bem ampla, mostrando as dificuldades legais perante a OMC. E já antecipando um trabalho importante para os escritórios de advocacia. Né? Claro. Já está, isso vai ser uma sopa no mel, como se diz aqui no Brasil. Então, para comentar o que foi dito, eu passo a palavra à Vera.
Pronto. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Look, René, be ready. IBRAC can start organizing a lot of seminars. I fully agree with Ambassador. It's a pleasure to comment these issues. Look, trade is an environment can be compatible, but look, there is no agreement on environment, right? The word environment appears in the WHO, in the preamble, and in the agreement on TBT. That's it. I spent 15 years, in Geneva, and every time that they start discussing an agreement on environment, this proposal was killed immediately. So it's impossible to bring this to the WHO. At the old times, imagine now, right? But there is a marvelous database on environment measures in WHO. And there is 13,000 measures related to environment already. And it's a marvelous work that are trying to categorize these measures related to trade, but certainly environmental measures. So CBN will be another one. They are other most effective, perhaps. The second point is this: how to deal with the issue on externality. What is an externality? Something wrong that you have to pay because you are doing this. And in economy, you cannot get a solution for this discussion. Should we put the penalty on price or on quantity? That's the difference between the United States and the European Union. The United States want to put on price, the European Union on quantity. And that's the thing that probably is not going to be solvable, right? The models will be different, the fights will be huge. And I read, Warren, with a lot of care, the huge amount of paper from the CBN. And to tell you the truth, I am living this again. I spent 3 or 4 years in Geneva writing reports on the proposal of tax border of the United States in 2005. Remember? United States tried to do this and it was killed. And I spent 3 years writing reports, attending meetings. It's a terrible discussion. Again, the same points. And sorry to say that at this time, I think that the European Union is doing a much better way, much better job, right? I fully agree with analysis on Article 2, 3, 3, 4, all of this. But I think that these certificates, because you can deal it around the world, something is going to be done. And I prefer perhaps a certificate than the US border tax. Because at that time, we tried to see how we are going to calculate the cost of cutting emission in the American systems. For the case of Brazil, for steel, when you have a different production of energy, how you are going to include this? And in the law, I saw the proposal, the amendment that an American deputy introduced in the Congress in the United States, right? 2-3 weeks ago, there is Mr. Korn or Burns, something like that, that proposed an amendment. And the name of the law is perfect in the United States, an amendment to tax code. So it's a tax. And this is not the issue that the European Union is doing. It's not a tax at the border. It's not a fee. The law, the proposal of the American law says a fee. And this was the problem in 2005, right? And I think that the European Union is going to in a better way. I fully agree with you. This is going to raise disputes. But sorry, Warren, what kind of dispute? They are going to go to the WHO. Okay, you are going to have a panel and then an arbitration at the end. Remember, the United States is not helping to conclude any agreement to put dispute settlement again on board. So the US will be challenged because of this. And to finalize, the question here is China. If you go to all the countries that will be affected, there are workers on UNCTAD, there are workers of the community, a lot of simulations, and you have China as the first and Russia as the second one that will be really penalized. Brazil is only on iron and in the 5th position, something like that. So the big issue will be Russia and China. Again, nothing will be solved. The conflict will raise. And tell me the future, Warren. Are you see any chance that a new organizational environment gets in? No way. So no, the big countries are not interested in solving the issue to reorganize WTO because they are very comfortable on preferential agreements, right? Why China has this RCEP, you have TPP, you have all these arrangements with the European Union. So perhaps this kind can be solved, not solved, but using together in this kind of agreements. The European Union can ask Brazil, look, in the new agreement, let's try to put a carbon mechanism system, something like that. And I think that the European Union is going to get this because the European Union changed completely the order of the new relaunch of the economy based on environment. So I think that the system you have a better luck this time, right? So these are my comments, and I fully agree with Warren. Politically, I don't see any chance that the Republicans will help to put this new law on inform. So Tetyana, I hope that this time the community have a better chance. And look, Warren, I work a lot with the REACH reports of the European Union on chemistry. Come on, if REACH was not challenged in the WTO, forget about CBAM. CBAM, you'll be discussed a lot, but I don't think that CBAM you have the chance of being defeated in what kind of panel we are going to have. Again, CBAM and REACH, they are two nightmares for exporters. And I think that this time, the European Union have a lot of support to have it. That's it, finish. Very, very good panel. I really enjoyed it.
Obrigado, Vera. Eu pergunto se a Tetyana e o Warren querem fazer algum comentário sobre o que os outros disseram.
Perhaps, if you allow me, just a very short reaction first to your comment to question that you raised after my presentation, and then a few comments following Mr. Maruyama's presentation. So in respect of the extension of the CBAM, of the scope of the CBAM proposal to other products, indeed it is possible, and the proposal makes clear that by the end of the transitional period, so by the end of 2025, the European Commission may propose to include additional products in Annex 1. Now, logically speaking, because the CBAM has to essentially cover the products that are already covered by EU ETS, it is unlikely that some products that are not included in the EU ETS will be included in CBAM. You mentioned that there was some proposal on including the forestry products. I haven't seen that comment or request probably from the industry in the EU. However, pulp and as well paper and board are included in the EU ETS. So in principle, it is possible that at some point the CBAM will also cover those products. I have come across a comment from the farmers during the ongoing public consultation on CBAM that argued that essentially the fertilizers are already expensive in the EU, and now in addition, because of certain duties that are imposed, and anti-dumping and countervailing duties that are imposed on fertilizers in the European Union, and that this CBAM will even make the price of the fertilizers in the EU higher. And so they proposed to include the agricultural products in the CBAM. But for the time being, as I mentioned, because the agricultural sector such is not covered by the EU ETS, it is unlikely that it's going to be also included in the CBAM. However, who knows for the coming years, as the EU also amends its EU ETS system and expands it, maybe certain mirroring regulations will be also adopted to include agricultural products in CBAM. I would like to next comment on the point raised by Mr. Maruyama in respect of the free emission allowances. And indeed, there is this question of the free emission allowances for certain producers in the European Union. However, the CBAM proposal makes clear that the free emission allowances and the CBAM proposal will not apply concurrently, meaning that the free emission allowances will be phased out gradually, and the amount of CBAM certificates that will need to be surrendered will be adjusted to the amount of free allowances that are granted to EU producers that are subject to EU ETS. And so essentially the idea is indeed that there will be kind of no more favorable treatment for EU producers because they receive this free allowances, while the importers need to pay through to purchase this CBAM certificates. Now, how it's going to be exactly implemented is not clear yet. What is mentioned in the proposal is that the transitional periods will last at least until 2030. So until 2030, there will be a coexistence and co-adjustment of CBAM and the free allocation of allowances. And my final comment is on the issue of WTO compatibility. As I mentioned in my presentation, currently several WTO members conduct bilateral consultations with the European Union to address their concerns, among others in respect to WTO compatibility of the CBAM. And indeed, the issues arise in particular under Article 3 and 1 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Since essentially it is an internal regulation, there might be also some additional issues arising under other agreements, but this is subject to further clarifications also by the European Commission. But at the same time, I agree with Professor Torstensen that for the European Union, this proposal is of utmost importance, and it will not give up on implementing the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And the ultimate question then will be, if there will be a WTO panel, is whether the EU will be able to justify it under Article 20. So that will be then the ultimate question. And at this point, even prior to the possibility of bringing a complaint to the WTO, as I have mentioned, countries have a chance to discuss with the EU and to explain what are their issues, practical issues for implementing the CBAM and complying with the CBAM, and also proposing some alternative ways how to design the CBAM and maybe adjust the CBAM so that the EU can still implement them and take them on board. And this again may facilitate compliance by exporters in third countries. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah.
Obrigado, Warren. Alguma palavra?
Yeah, just a quick one. First, it's been a very lively and useful panel. I've learned a lot from Tetyana. Enjoyed Vera's pointed questions. I guess the one thing I would say is it's not clear how this is going to end up, but it's the only thing that is clear is it's going to be great for lawyers, trade experts, and for EU bureaucracy, because they're probably going to need several thousand people to administer the CBAM and run around to every producer in the world to try and figure out how much carbon they're emitting and what sort of inputs they're using in their product and how much those inputs contain. So it's going to be an incredible thing to administer. I'm a bird watcher, so I hope at some point the world gets together and does something about climate change. I would also hope to go to Brazil, since you have some incredible birds. But you know, this is one of those things that needs a multilateral agreement, and it's not really workable in a plurilateral system. You know, there are some issues that can be handled plurilaterally or through joint statements, like maybe government procurement. But in some ways, this is like agriculture, where as far as agricultural export subsidies, if you commit to restrict your export subsidies, but don't have some of the big other countries that do export subsidies involved, you're just inviting free riders, and it's just a form of unilateral disarmament. So in some ways, dealing with climate requires the world to come together in something that has broad coverage, and particularly of some of the developing countries that have turned into very big emitters like China and India. I hope that at some point, you know, the trade world comes back to its more pragmatic moorings in the GATT system, and the WTO turns back into a functioning organization that can reach consensus and develop rules to address some of the challenges that are out there. And those challenges are big, and they've been growing. And I think one of them is what to do about climate change border measures. But this should keep all of us occupied for at least 10 years, particularly younger people like Tetyana, who have a lot more time to bill some hours out of this thing. And so it's really been a great panel, and really enjoyed the back and forth and the discussion.
Just a comment. I fully agree with Ms. Warren. Look, if there is no any kind of adjustment at the border, what the community, the European Union can do is to support the development of standards in the sense of voluntary standards. That's it. Instead of a clear legal or something justification with a legal justificate at the border, something like that, or a certificate because it's not at the border, the European Union can develop standards for emissions, and that's it. Without a certificate that as a TBT, right? With a refrigerator, a ton of steel, something like that, it's not going to enter the community because of the emission that they are going to impose. Again, the PPM discussion all over again. So, but I think that there is other way. The question raised by Ambassador, I fully agree. Deforestation is the issue of the European Union for a long time. If you go to the old regulations on environment, there's a lot of bans on products produced in the forests that are devastated. It's the way the European Union can impose a ban immediately on Brazil because there's a law is there, right? And again, without a label, without a standard, you cannot export anymore because the private, the big importers are not going to allow this. So the point is, it's better to have a law, an agreement on CBAN than to continue with the voluntary standards in the sense that nobody is controlling them, right? And there is a case now that the big supermarkets are not buying meat from Brazil because Brazil is devastating the forest. That's it. So it is a way, and a lot of propaganda can help more than the legal issue. But anyway, Tetyana, I hope that you have a good word, the way you belong till we got this, right? Very good. Ambassador, a question that appears here is about if Brazil is going to open a CBN panel. I think it's better, Lauro, is to negotiate. Negotiate. Come on, we have an agreement with the European Union. Let's go to negotiate. Let's go to establish cooperation, standards together. Let's see if you can develop a market for carbon. Why not? And let's put the market on the interest. And I know already that the forest and the people that deals with forest and on paper and pulp and all this are working already with this kind of initiative. Let's go to the positive instead of the negative. I don't think that, don't bring this to the WTO. This is going to really to kill it in a way that is not going to revival. I think let's try to put it in another way. Negotiate, right. Okay, Ambassador, up to you.
Bom, eu acho que, eu não sei se há outras perguntas aí, eu não sei se houve, na minha informação aqui, não há nenhuma outra pergunta. Eu acho que o quadro que foi pintado pelos dois panelistas e os comentários da Vera mostram a complexidade do assunto, né? Quer dizer, e o nível da burocracia que vai ser criada. E mostra a grande dificuldade de implementação, a não ser que seja unilateral por parte da União Europeia, porque isso vai ser questionado na OMC. E a OMC, do jeito que está, sem juízes, sem o órgão de apelação, vai ser muito difícil a implementação disso. E nós vamos ver como esse tema vai se desenrolar proximamente, porque realmente a União Europeia, né, a pressão política sobre a União Europeia na questão da mudança de clima é muito grande. E eles estão respondendo politicamente, vai haver eleição aí na França, então essa é uma resposta política para esse assunto. Agora, tecnicamente, como é que vai ser feito? Isso, para mim, não ficou claro. Quer dizer, se não for feito unilateralmente, isso não vai ser... Se for colocado unilateralmente, vai ser questionado na OMC, imediatamente. E foi aventada a possibilidade, ou estão dizendo que já há contatos entre os países. No caso do Brasil, nós temos possibilidade de conversar bilateralmente ainda com a União Europeia por causa do acordo. E estamos esperando, do lado da União Europeia, essa carta adicional, esse protocolo adicional que eles estão prometendo. Mas o governo brasileiro e os governos do Mercosul já disseram que não aceitam nenhum compromisso adicional àquilo que está incluído no tratado. Então, essa questão da carbon tax não vai ser incluído nesse protocolo adicional. Então, eu acho que nós temos aí um problema político e um problema comercial muito importante. Eu agradeço a participação de todos. René.
Embaixador, eu vi que tem aqui uma pergunta no Q&A, mas foi exatamente sobre esse comentário que o senhor acabou de fazer sobre a side letter. Então, está dada a resposta. Mas eu tenho uma pergunta, e vou aqui abusar da condição de organizador, porque de tudo que está sendo falado, nós temos, me parece que, duas linhas aqui. Uma linha muito pragmática para as empresas, que tem o prazo que vai ter que ser analisado, que vai ter que ser cuidado. Então, ou seja, as empresas terão que começar a iniciar a sua preparação para estar prontas para atender dentro do prazo. Por outro lado, também vai ter um canal diplomático, potencialmente um contencioso. Se o Brasil não entrar como demandante, entra como terceira parte, com todas as implicações que venham dessa escolha. Mas, pragmaticamente, as empresas vão ter que começar a pensar em como atender. Queria ouvir os painelistas sobre esse aspecto, porque, obviamente, que mesmo que se inicie um painel nos próximos 6 meses, com a notícia de que tem consultas já sendo realizadas, embora não ainda dentro do pedido de consultas que precede um painel, isso pode escalonar rapidamente. Então, acho que seria interessante ouvi-los do ponto de vista das empresas brasileiras desses setores que estão afetados, o que é que poderiam começar a fazer do ponto de vista pragmático, considerando que isso está na mesa, né?
Algum comentário?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, René, for this question. Indeed, as you correctly have mentioned, Brazilian business, Brazilian exporters can already start preparing for the forthcoming carbon border adjustment mechanism, because as I mentioned, it will likely start applying already from 2023, the transitional period. And in terms of how to start preparing is first to analyze what is exactly required and to potentially also communicate to the Brazilian government certain practical issues that they may encounter in complying with the current CBAM proposal. So, for instance, one of the issues that I have noted when reading the proposal is that during the transitional period, the exporters will need to already calculate not only the direct but also indirect emissions and to report those. Now, there is still no methodology for how to calculate them, and it's not clear when this methodology is going to be adopted. If exporters, or better to say, if importers do not comply with the reporting requirement also on indirect emissions, they will be penalized. So they will have to pay some fines probably. Now, it doesn't really make sense to penalize the importers, and they will then probably pass on this cost to the exporters that did not provide the necessary data, where there is no methodology how to calculate those emissions. So one of the issues that could be raised, for instance, with the European Union is perhaps the transitional period should be without penalties, or the transitional period should start a bit later. So these are the practical issues that could be further discussed. There are also certain other questions related, for instance, to the so-called markup. In the proposal, it is primarily related to the carbon price paid abroad, so it's not exactly relevant for the Brazilian exporters, but might be relevant for exporters from third countries. Then the practical question about the verifiers. As I have mentioned, currently it's not very clear whether, let's say, Brazilian authorized verifiers that have been certified by the relevant certification body can do the verifications, or whether it is really only the EU verifiers that will need to do the verifications, because this in practice then will mean both additional costs and more time, because we don't know whether there will be enough EU verifiers to come to Brazil in due time and do all the necessary verifications. So this type of questions that could be then channeled through the government of Brazil to the European Union, and I'm sure that from the perspective of the business there can be additional questions as well. Thank you.
Mr. Warren, do you want to add something? Your phone.
No, I'm good right now.
2 minutes. Let me give you one
comentário.
Well, let me try to answer René. René, look, Brazil has positive points in this discussion, a lot of positive points. And so let's go, I discussed this already, the iron of Brazil is better, is less polluter, and the energy, the networks of energy and so on. So the best thing is to start doing the exercise, calculating for the sector. 5 sectors is nothing. It will be cheaper than to hire a lawyer of $15 million to bring this issue to the WTO without no answer. And it's better to, and I fully agree with Tetyana, the certifiers, why not the European firms that are certifiers in Brazil? Why not to discuss with them and develop a way to raise all the numbers and all the calculus that are needed? So it's a new work, it's a new word and work. And I think that we have a long way to discuss this. And we have positive inputs in the discussion, much better than China because of the energy batteries and so on. So instead of fight, negotiate. Thank you.
Obrigado, Vera. Obrigado, Tetyana. Thank you very much for your answer. Ambassador, I think we do have one question. It talks about the reaction from China and India in case if these measures focus on China and India emissions, for example, do you think it will be effective? Can you predict reactions? I saw that Warren responded on the chat. Maybe Warren wants to provide his views on this question.
Well, just from having dealt with China and India, USTR, although it was 10 years ago, my guess is the reaction to a EU measure that singled them out for carbon border measures is going to be very, very negative. Given the breakdown of the WTO dispute settlement system, I think it's viewed less and less as a viable remedy for situations like this. And we're seeing governments get much quicker on the trigger when they think that there's something outrageous that's going on that affects their trade. And to the extent that anyone in the Trump administration may have thought that our Section 232 tariffs would we could get away with them while it wended its way through the WTO for 5 or 6 years. That turned out not to be correct. And the EU slapped tariffs on our bourbon whiskey, our blue jeans from Levi's, and our Harley Davidson motorcycles, 3 iconic American products. And I think the Chinese reaction would be somewhat similar. And, you know, this goes back to the Kyoto Convention and the Clinton administration's decision to go along with an agreement that effectively exempted China and India from global climate disciplines. And, you know, now their economies have grown, particularly China, and it's now, you know, I think the world's leading emitter with a lot of coal-fired electricity. So how you get that horse back into the barn is a big issue, but I'm a trade negotiator, not a climate negotiator, so I'll leave that one to them.
Thank you, Warren. Embaixador, não temos mais perguntas no Q&A. Devolvo você.
Bom, muito obrigado por todos. Foi uma reunião muito instrutiva, né? Esse assunto praticamente não é discutido no Brasil. Foi muito interessante ouvir a opinião e as insights de todos os participantes. Eu queria agradecer mais uma vez o René Medrado por ter colocado em pé esse seminário e agradecer a Vera pelos comentários, o Warren e a Tetyana pelos seus comentários. Muito obrigado a todos. Bom dia.
Obrigado, embaixador. Muito bem. Pedi para colocar o Lauro Celidoni também aqui na tela.
Muito obrigado a todos, acho que foi excelente aí o debate. Gostei bastante. Estamos todos na expectativa do que vai acontecer nos próximos passos, como as empresas brasileiras vão reagir, vão obter essa certificação, vão calcular as emissões. E também teremos aí a COP26 em Glasgow, nos próximos tempos aí, final de outubro, novembro. Esse assunto deve surgir, deve ser amplamente discutido. Nós, para falar a verdade, eu nem sabemos qual é a posição brasileira, tanto nessa questão do CBAM quanto em outras questões ambientais. Então, será um tema realmente muito importante para que prestemos atenção no que os nossos representantes vão dizer.
A questão da educação como um todo, óbvio que a posição do Brasil não é
Estou te ouvindo agora sem aquela interrupção, pode terminar.
Não, basicamente era isso, só que vai ser tremendamente interessante a gente ver qual vai ser a posição brasileira na COP26, né? Muitas empresas estão desconfiadas se apoiam ou não, se vão junto com o Ministério de Meio Ambiente ou não, junto à COP26, e esse assunto certamente vai ser um dos temas mais discutidos lá, quer dizer, tanto o CBAM quanto os projetos de lei americanos e qual vai ser a reação do governo brasileiro a eles. Era isso. Muito obrigado, Renê.
Sem dúvida. Obrigado, Lauro. Sem dúvida, o bode está na sala, a gente vai ter que saber lidar com isso. E para os advogados, para todos aqueles que lidam com comércio internacional, meio ambiente, é hora de estudar o assunto. Bom, fechando aqui então esse segundo dia, segunda manhã do nosso seminário. Amanhã nós vamos retomar às 9 horas. Temos um painel, começando às 9 até 10h15, sobre acordos internacionais de comércio, no CARF, e depois, às 10h30, o anúncio dos ganhadores do Prêmio BRAC de Comércio Internacional, que foi bastante concorrido e todos curiosos aí para ver quem ganhou. Tá bom? Obrigado a todos e até amanhã.